Hey everyone, welcome to the next webinar, Building XM Cloud Sites using ASP.NET with Rob Earlham. We were just chatting up. It's been a really, really long time since I've seen Rob in person. But to start off, Rob, like I know for the longest time, I've been doing Sitecore since 2007, but it's always been .NET. And then late last decade, things started coming out, like JSS came out and there was a focus on, the JS frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, and things. And even though I think there was always an SDK for the .NET rendering host, but no one really like advertised it, I guess, as much as they should have. So it kind of got lost, or people kind of assume that if you're going to build a site nowadays, which is headless, you only think of Next.js for whatever reason. And there are still companies and developers who dedicate themselves to the .NET stack that need is .NET in the sense, if a company has an Azure-based thing and they are pure .NET shop, they might want to build the site on .NET, and not many people know. And I was asking you a million questions the other day, so this is in a very, very timely fashion. So setting it all up that this is all about building everything in ASP.NET with the XM Cloud. So all yours, Rob.
Thanks, Akshay. You're dead right. So I spoke at Symposium last year, kind of about a little bit about the history of building with Sitecore, and I talked a lot about what you were just saying. We started off 100% .NET. It was all ASP.NET framework, and then about 5 or 6 years ago, it all kind of switched over towards Next.js and Angular and Vue. But in reality, we've got a really rich history with .NET, and it kind of got pushed to the side a bit. And this is what I talked about at Symposium last year. And if anyone wants a link to that session, I've done it for a few user groups, and I'm happy to share that afterwards. When you asked me to come and speak, I thought of basically kind of doing a follow-on to that session. So I'm not going to touch too much on the history here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what it is like day-to-day building with ASP.NET Core now instead of ASP.NET Framework. But yeah, building with ASP.NET for XM Cloud. So that's kind of what we're going to dig into today. So before we get started too far, for anyone who hasn't met me before, my name's Rob Earlham. I've been with Sitecore for about 9 years now in a bunch of different roles. I'm currently head of developer advocacy for Sitecore. Basically, long and the short of it is it's my role to try and make every developer building with our product successful. You can see a bunch of social links on the screen there. So if anyone wants to get in touch after or has any questions, feel free to give me a shout. So ASP.NET Core SDK. As Akshay touched on before, we had a previous version of this, which was called the ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK. This was released, I think that was like version 9 of our platform DXP, XM and XP, allowing you to build headless sites for that platform using ASP.NET Core. It kind of didn't get much love after it was first released, but we know we've got a lot of partners and customers who want to build with .NET. So there's been a few of us petitioning internally to get an updated version of this built for XM Cloud, and that's what we've been doing. So we've re-released a new refactor of that SDK, and we've given it a new name along the way. So we dropped the name rendering out of the SDK because it does more than that for a start, but also because it does signify that this is a new SDK. It's not just a new version. So there are some people who built on the old one. If you want to migrate to the new one, the path is pretty smooth, but there are a few steps you'll have to take to do it, and that's all documented on our documentation site. It is available today. It's currently in alpha release, so there's some features that we're still working on, but a lot of the main nuts and bolts you're going to be using to build a CMS site, we're going to take a look at all there. We have an XM Cloud starter kit available today as well. So anyone who's looked at XM Cloud from the Next.js or Angular side, you may have seen what's called the Foundation Head repository in GitHub. That's the initial starter kit for the JavaScript apps. We have basically the exact same repository, but with an ASP.NET Core head instead of a JavaScript head in there. So all the surrounding elements are the same. It's just the actual application that's different. And both of those repositories are open source on GitHub. So we're really trying to get more into the open source scene. It's fantastic for the community. It means that, if you do run into an issue with the SDK, you can actually get the source code and see where that might be. You can open an issue against it. And another big one is we'd love to get contributions. So if it's a small fix and you feel confident to do that, please open a PR. We'd love to get contributions from the community on this as well. So before I start to show code and we'll build some components using this, I want to talk a little bit about how this works under the hood. So XM Cloud is a headless application. What that means is it's a SaaS platform, and there's lots of different application elements behind the scenes in there. But what you're going to do is, as developers using that platform, you're going to build a ASP.NET Core application, and you're going to deploy it to each of the regions you're working in. That might be something like Azure in a web application, in a web app there, and you may have multiple web apps across your different regions you're working in. Each of those web apps will make requests through to XM Cloud, the XM Cloud platform, and that's going to return the data back that it needs to render out the different experiences that your marketers created. So what I want to do is kind of dig into one of those apps and XM Cloud and kind of show how that data moves between the two and how it's processed. And that should hopefully give us a good basis before we start to fire up Visual Studio and start to look at some code. So in XM Cloud on the right, in the red box, we have all of our editing interfaces. And this is what I mean when I say we have a bunch of different applications within XM Cloud. There's more than I'm showing here as well. I'm just kind of going over the basics here. We have our sites manager, which is where if you have a multi-site instance, you can configure all those different sites. We have our page builder, which is where you can configure the pages that are rendered within those sites. And we also have a component builder, which is what's used to build out of the box kind of marketing control components, really simple content ones that you don't need a developer to build for. So your marketing team will come along and they'll interact with each of those different applications, and they'll craft these different experiences that they want to deliver to their end users. They hit the publish button, and all of that is cached in what's called Experience Edge. And this is our globally scaled edge delivery platform. And that means that all that data they've created basically gets converted down into JSON at the end of the day. And that's cached globally. So wherever you deploy your .NET application, it's there and available and lightning fast to request. So then you, as the developer, comes along and you build your ASP.NET Core application. That's the blue box on the left we're looking at. And you install the .NET SDK. And from there, you start to consume the data that's been cached out on Edge. And there's a couple of different layers I want to touch on within the SDK. The first is the GraphQL client. So when you load up an app that's built with the SDK, you might, for example, go and request the /news page or the /news route. What will happen here is the GraphQL client will make a layout request for that route to Experience Edge, and it will receive a really big wall of JSON, basically describing all of the different components and all of the data that needs to be rendered out for that route you requested. We then take that data, pass that all into strongly typed models. This being a .NET app, that's kind of how we want to work. That's the thing we like about .NET, is having that type safety that we can rely on. We then take those models, pass them into our views, and the SDK provides a series of tag helpers designed to render out the data that's just stored in each of the different fields that have been created on the CMS side. And there's a couple of different views available, and we're going to look at both of these today. The first is the model bound views. So this is kind of the type of view you're going to be using the majority of the time when you're building a site with XM Cloud. It's really good for simple concept views. If you have something just like a title control where you're pulling a single field from Sitecore, it could be something more complex where you have like a news article where you may be pulling 5, 6, 7, 10 fields from Sitecore. But the key thing is all the data is just coming from Sitecore. It's not coming from any other systems. You're not having to add any logic in there to process the data afterwards. It's simply taking the data out of the CMS and putting it on the screen exactly as it was entered. If you're doing that kind of action, model bound views are really good to go with. Obviously, that's not going to cut it all the time, though. A lot of the time, you need to have more complex logic included, and that's where view components come in. So view components, they're a standard thing in ASP.NET Core. And they're really good for complex views because it lets you basically control how the view is rendered and when the view action is called. And that means you can run C# code beforehand. That's really good if you're doing things like interacting with third-party systems. That's a common one we're seeing for this. And building headlessly, that's a really common action. For example, if you're building something like an e-commerce site, you'll probably be pulling content out of the CMS, but you might want to pull product data out of a PIM or from your e-com system or something like that. In this scenario, view components are going to be really good because you can still pull all the content out of XM Cloud, but then you can add your own C# code to reach out to a third-party system and pull that data in. And we'll see that in action shortly. The last one is partial views. I included it here for completeness. Again, it's standard functionality in MVC. We're not going to dig too much into this today. Basically, it just allows you to create subcomponents. So if you're creating like a carousel component, you may have each item in your carousel be a partial, just to keep your main carousel cleaner and to split things out logically, basically. So a handy thing to keep your code clean, but it's not something we're going to dig too much into today. Okay, so I touched on tag helpers a little bit a minute ago. These are really important when you're working with the SDK. It's one of the key pieces of functionality we have. If you look on the markup from a view on the right, you'll see what we have for a promo component that's provided out of the box in the starter kit. And there's a lot of standard HTML in there, but you'll see there's a couple of tags, which are the tag helpers, which will come out of the SDK. And they're the ones we start with SC dash. So we have an SC dash image for rendering images, an SC dash text for rendering text, and an SC dash link for rendering links. And you can see we have the ASP4 attribute on there where we're passing in a field from within the promo model that's defined at the top. This is used to basically render out an image field that's defined in the CMS, a text field from the CMS, and a link field from the CMS. Now, you might be asking, why don't we just use an ing tag, an img tag? Why don't we use a p tag? Why don't we use an anchor? The reason for that is support for editing functionality. So when I go and load this component into the page builder application, if I've used an SC image tag helper here, it will enable that image to be content managed. So your marketer can come along, they can then go and change that image for something else out of your media library. They can go and overtype the text in the SC text tag helper. They can change the SC link tag helper to link to any other location they want to. And we have support for all the different field types in Sitecore. You can see all the list on the left-hand side here. Okay, so I touched on the fact that this is an alpha release, and there are some features that we're still working on, so I definitely want to cover that first. The first one is metadata editing. So I finished building this out a couple of weeks ago. It's still in PR. As I mentioned, the SDK is all open source, though. So if you go to the SDK, I'll show you the links to both those at the end. You can go and check out the PR and see what's been built and see what process it's in. For those of you that don't know, metadata editing is a really cool piece of functionality that lets the page builder connect down to a local developer instance running your head application. Embedded personalization. These are kind of the two big ones that are getting worked on currently. That's in progress currently. I should have mentioned before, it's myself and Ivan Leakins who are building this out, and he's in the process of building out the embedded personalization piece. Component support. So we don't currently have component support. I mentioned before that components is the application that allows marketers to build really simple content components. We currently have that in the backlog. Form support as well, and also deploy app support. So you can deploy all this yourself, but if you go into the deploy app and create a new project, if you're using Next.js and Angular, you could use it. It's basically inbuilt in there. So you can go and just click that, click OK, and it'll go and provision your repo. It'll provision an editing host for you, all of this kind of niceness. This is being built out by the deploy team themselves. It's in their backlog. So you can still do all the same things you can with ASP.NET Core. It's just a bit manual. You've got to go and clone the template repository yourself. You then got to use your bring your own repository flow instead of using the standard template. Also, when it comes to editing hosts, we currently only support JavaScript or NPM-based editing hosts in XM Cloud, or basically hosting them ourselves. So what you need to do to enable it for marketers is to use what's called an external editing host. So if you're hosting your main app in Azure, what you'll most likely do is stand up an extra instance in Azure and point pages to that. So it'll load the external instance instead of one loaded on our hard disk or on our infrastructure. Okay, so I think that's enough with slides. Let's go and take a look at some of this in action. I'm going to hop over to GitHub first. And this is the XM Cloud starter kit that I talked about, the .NET starter kit. So this is basically everything you need to get started building with ASP.NET Core and XM Cloud. It is an ASP.NET Core application. It has the SDK pre-installed, and it has a bunch of sample components for you out of the box. This is a template repository in GitHub. For those of you that don't know what that means, is you can click here and then you can click Create New Repository, and it'll create a duplicate of it wherever you want. So you can click your owner and then give it a name. We do this instead of forking because what it allows you to then do is change the visibility of this. So if we didn't have this and only had it as forks, because this is an open source repository, it'd mean that every customer's code base for XM Cloud is open source as well, and we obviously don't want that. So you go and use the template repository creation instead. I did a bit of this setup ahead of time to basically save us a bit of time today, and I've already done that. So this is my ASP.NET Core getting started. You can see I created it about 3 days ago when I was building out this presentation. And this is basically a repo that's based on that template repository. You can see I added a couple more commits in here. What I've done here is I've actually built a local version of the SDK, which includes that pages metadata support I was talking about before, because it means we can leverage that through the demo today. And I'll talk about where that's a little different as we go through. Okay, I think next up we'll take a look in Visual Studio. So this is the ASP.NET Core starter running in Visual Studio, well, loaded into Visual Studio. I've loaded up the application here, and you can see it's a pretty standard .NET Core application. We have our program CS where everything's configured. Take a quick look in here. You can see this is where we load in things like our middleware. So you can see we're adding things like our GraphQL handler, the layout service, pages service. This is what's related to the pages metadata stuff I was talking about before. All of this is documented. Both we have auto-generated documentation on the SDK. We also have good documentation on our main doc.sitecore.com site as well. Now, what I need to do first, I need to get my local application running, pointing to my instance of pages, because I want to get my data from there and run it locally. So to do that, we need to set up our app settings. If I load this up, you can see we have a bunch of properties in here we need to set. We need to set the context ID, and that's going to tell my application, basically tell the SDK, which environment in XM Cloud to pull the data from. We then need a site name. So which site am I loading? Because we're a multi-site platform, so we need to choose which one we're going to load up. And an editing secret. And that basically allows pages to connect back and be used for editing processes. So we could enter our data straight into here, but that's not good practice. What we're going to do is we're going to first of all go and create a .development version of this settings, because that's excluded automatically in the git ignore, and it means we're not actually accidentally going to commit any secrets and push those into our Git repository and have those leak out by mistake. I've got my development one loaded here. Now, you might be wondering where we get this data from. Well, we get that from our deploy app. So I've got that loaded up here. For anyone who hasn't loaded the XM or hasn't seen XM Cloud before, this is basically where you configure all your deployments from. You can see we have a bunch of projects already created here. I created this ASP.NET Core getting started project ahead of time. Again, just to save a bit of time provisioning all of this. And we have a single testing environment we're going to be working with today. When you go into there, you can see we have this developer settings section. And this is where you get everything you need to connect your local app down. Now, I touched on before the fact that we don't have native support in deploy for ASP.NET Core yet. And it becomes like kind of obvious in screens like this. This is all very NPM specific. You can go and copy this and paste it directly into a .env file in your Node project, and it'll work. We're working on getting basically a language selector in here so that it'll change over and it'll give you in JSON format to be able to use in .NET. But for now, we just have to copy the individual properties over. So I'm going to copy my context ID and we'll paste that in. Copy my site name. And the editing secret. And that's all it is. I can save this. I'm going to hit F5, and then that's going to go away and build the application. See this happening in our output window below. So as I said, it's built using a local version of the SDK in this case, because I wanted to make use of that metadata editing functionality. It's brought up a console window. I'll bring that over so you can see it. And it'll pop up a browser for us straight away. And you can see it's running on localhost 5001. And this is going to go over and it's going to connect to XM Cloud. And you can see I provisioned an instance of the skate park website ahead of time. This is a sample website you get out of the box with XM Cloud. And it's a pretty simple example site, giving you a few components so you can see how a site might look once it's provisioned. If you're building a site from scratch, you wouldn't use the skate park template site. You'd use the empty site. But for demos like this, it's really helpful. So we can move that out of the way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop back to my original browser. The reason for that is when you run it via F5, Visual Studio kind of ties to that browser. And when I stop it and start it as we go through, it'll open and close that browser over and over. And I want to keep a persistent window open in here. So we've got my testing environment loaded here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go open the dashboard and that'll connect me into the environment itself. And it takes us into the sites application. And you can see here we have one site that's been created already called the skate park. I'm going to click and load that up. And it takes us into the new analytics dashboard for that site. Obviously, we're not going to see any data here. I only created this, I think, yesterday morning. There hasn't been any traffic to it. But once your site's live, this is where you're going to learn all the data about how your site's been leveraged. So you get all the data about the analytics being used, the A/B tests, and then any tasks and localization information. What I want to do today is use the button in the top right and load up the page builder though. And what this is going to do is going to load up pages and it's going to try and connect to this site. And first of all, we're going to get an error. And that is because we don't have an editing host defined. This is what I talked about before about the fact that we don't have support for .NET editing host yet. What you need to do is you need to go and configure an external editing host, which will allow your marketers to load this up and do their marketing activities. Again, all that's documented on our doc site. But what we could do today is to start to use this metadata editing, which is defined in here. It allows us to go and connect to a local host. So I can go HTTPS localhost 5001, hit save. And this is now going to go and connect to that local app that I had running, and it's going to pull it directly into Pages. And you can see here, now I get the editing kind of chromes around it that allow me to go and overtype text if I want. I can go and change the image over here. And this is what I was talking about with the tag helpers. So if I hadn't rendered these components out with tag helpers, if they hadn't been rendered with that, you wouldn't get this editing interface ability, basically. You can see here, these aren't. These are controlled differently, so you can't edit them. Whereas over here, you can actually go and edit all of this text imagery. The thing I want to call out here is just how quickly we got this up and running. When I started and loaded Visual Studio, I'd previously cleaned it back to an empty repo. So it was as if I just checked it out. And we've gone from basically having a clean checkout to a running local application ready to do development on, also connected into the page builder experience that took about 3 or 4 minutes maybe, and along with me talking a little bit along the way as well. So it's a super fast dev cycle now. You can go from checking out your repository to being a productive developer in a matter of minutes. It's really, really fast, which I'm loving right now. Okay, so developers need to build things. We need to go and build some components. So what I'm going to do first is this is using this text component up here. I don't really like that. I'm going to change it. I'm going to build a new component. I'm going to build a component which has kind of a H1 tag in there for a title and some text you can have below, like a title and text component. So yeah, we're going to go and do that. We're going to build a new component. So to do that, I'm going to use this menu in the top left. And first of all, we're going to go to the content editor for this environment. There's less and less need to drop back to the content editor. For those of you who've come from XM and XP, this is going to be very familiar. But this is basically the old interface we had from the platform DXP. And we're moving further and further away from having to use it. One of the places you do still have to use it is when provisioning new components. And that's what we're going to do now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up the feature module here. And this is where all of the rendering definitions are, where all your components are defined. And I'm going to go to my rich text component. And when you're creating a component, we do recommend to use the clone rendering script. And that's because there's more items than just this item definition that are required for a component. There's template items, there's data source items, there's parameter items. So when you use the clone rendering window like this, you get all of those created for you. It's much easier than creating it yourself. So I'm going to give it a name, title, and text. And this is only going to be available for my site. So I'm going to move it and put it in the skate park project layer. Go to the parameters tab. We're going to create a copy of the original parameters. We don't want to reference them. And that allows me to change them just for this component. Same for the data source. That also means if I change the rich text components data source, which if we left it as inheritance would also update for this one, I want to break that link between. And this will complete and create it all pretty quickly. There we go. So if we look in our project renderings folder here, we have our title and text component. The component name has been set to title and text. That's really important. We'll come back to that once we get to the code section in a minute, but you need to basically make note of that name. And then if we scroll down to the editor options, you can see it's created a new title and text parameters template, and it's created a data source template. I'm going to call it text for some reason. We'll update that in a second. So I'm going to go and change my templates because I want to create my title and text, don't I? So looking in here, let's create this text one. First of all, let's rename that to match. So we'll call it typing, title and text. And we'll use the section the same. You can actually put some spaces in there. And then I want to add a title field, which will be a single line text. I think what I'll do as well, I'll just save that first. I'm also going to rearrange the order of these. I think I'll move the title to be above the text. That seems to make more sense to me. And there we go. We have our component defined and we have it ready to use. What we need to do finally is to enable it for my site. So I'm going to go into my skate park site that was created. And I'm going to go into my available renderings. And this is basically how you define which renderings are available for which sites, because some will only be specific to some if you're in a multi-site environment. We have this page content section. I'm just going to drop it in here for now. In reality, I might create a new section if I was working properly, but this will work for today's demo. I'm going to go and add in our new title and text component. We'll save that. And basically, we now have everything ready to be able to go and use within our site. I'm going to go back to the page builder. And I'm going to refresh this page because we've added a new component. So we need to load the component changes in. Now, if we use this little tab here, this is how you can see what components are available. And if we scroll down to the bottom, you can see they're grouped by the folder structure they're in. And we have our title and text component. Well, you'll notice it's grayed out. If I hover on it, it gives us a little error saying title and text is not implemented for the current editing host. Please contact your administrator. And that's really good because that means it stops people from being able to add components to sites where they're not implemented yet. Maybe someone mistakenly adds a component to an available rendering section for a site where that component doesn't exist. This is a bit of a belt and braces approach to stop that. Well, basically stop a content editor mistakenly adding it to the page and then causing an error. So it's saying we haven't implemented the component because we haven't implemented the component. So that's what we need to do next. So if we hop back over to Visual Studio, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a model which represents that template I just created with the title and the text fields. So let's go and add a new class in here. We'll call it, my typing's correct, title and text. Okay, and we'll stop the app running in the background. So I'm going to need to rebuild it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste in some code that I have for this already. What we've done here is we've inherited from a base model. The base model is defined as part of the starter kit. I'm going to take a look in there. This basically has a load of pages-specific fields in there. So things like the component name. You can also define grid parameters to be able to define how it's rendered on the page. You can do inline styling if there's any dynamic placeholders defined in there. Inheriting from this base model that comes as part of the SDK gives you all that out of the box, and it lets us keep our component models pretty clean. We then defined our two fields. So we have our title field, which is a text field, which is a single line text. And then we have our text field, which is a rich text field. And these are field types which come out of the SDK. You'll notice we also have attributes defined on these. And these are both set to Sitecore component fields. Those attributes basically help the SDK know where in that big wall of JSON that comes out of Experience Edge to get this specific field's value from. So that's how it knows how to wire all that up. Okay, so we've got a model. We can save that. The next thing we need to do is to actually create a view to show, well, to actually define how this is all going to be rendered out. What we're going to be doing here is a model-bound view, a really simple controller. All the data is coming out of Sitecore. So all of your model-bound views, they all exist in this views, shared, components, Sitecore components folder. And these are the components that you get out of the box. So when I showed that components list in Page Builder before, anyone who would have looked through it would have seen row splitter, rich text, promo. All of these are the ones that are defined in the starter kit and provided out of the box when you first load a clean exemplar instance. So now we're going to go and create a new view. We'll just create an empty razor view. And again, we're going to call it title and text. And then once more, I'm just going to paste the content in. So you can see we have our model defined. So this is the title and text model we just created. And it's just a clean model. It's a dumb POCO that's been dropped in. You don't have to wrap it in generics to obscure any functionality that the SDK is doing. We're just using out-of-the-box core ASP.NET Core functionality. We're not kind of bending it in any weird and wonderful Sitecore way. So anyone who's used ASP.NET Core before, this is all going to be really familiar. We have some component wrapper HTML here. And you can see this is where we're using things like the model styles from the base model, the grid parameters, the ID. And this is all just helpful for the page builder to be able to render this out correctly. You can see we also have our tag builder used in a slightly different way here. Here we're defining a standard HTML H1 tag. But what you could do is, as long as you use the ASP.NET 4 attribute in here, you can actually make standard HTML tags run using the tag helper functionality, which is exactly what we want to use for our text field here, using our model.title. Let's not do that. Then below, we have an SC text, which is what's going to be used for our rich text field, the text field. Okay, so we can save that. Now, at this point, we've created our view. We've created our model. What we need to do, though, is we need to register them. We need to tell Sitecore and the SDK how to leverage them and basically wire it up to that rendering definition in the CMS. Remember I said the title and text field that was important? We need to make use of that. To do that, we have a service collection extension method in here. And basically what we're doing in here is, this is called in our program CS, the add starter kit views. And we're in here where we bind up all the views that are created. So we're going to add another model bound view. We will use the title and text model that we just created. Paste the same, so it's called the same. And basically at this point, what we're saying is the title and text component is defined in the CMS, will be rendered as a model bound view. It'll use the view, the name needs to match, and then it'll use the same model. And that's everything we need to do. So we can now hit F5 again. This will rebuild the application and reload it up. We'll see the browser pop up and it'll bring the site up for us again. And here's the site. You'll notice our component isn't being used yet because we've not actually loaded it onto the page yet. That's what we need to do. Let's hop back over to our page builder. The component's still grayed out because we haven't refreshed anything yet here. So we need to reload the page because that's at the point where it checks which components are available. So now the site's loaded up again. It's connected back to my local developer instance. I can go down now and I can see that my title and text components are no longer grayed out. So I'm going to remove this text component. I don't really like that. And I'm going to drag my title and text component instead, and we're going to drop this just above. And it's going to take a little minute while it loads everything in. And here you can see it knows that there are two fields rendered with tag helpers, but there's no actual data for them yet. Again, because we've used the tag helper functionality, this enables the CMS WYSIWYG editing functionality. So I can go into here and I can say, hello, Connor Boss. And it's with an A, isn't it? Make sure I spell it right. And then I can type in here and go, this is the best. Oh, my type is awful today. Skate park ever. And Pages will automatically save this. So as I type, this content's automatically saved back, created into a data source item for me. And we can see this is now been created, added, and we've basically gone through the dev process of creating a really simple, two-field model-bound view for use in the site. Super easy. Okay, so that's a nice simple example. I want to build something a little more complex though. This is a cool skate park. People are going to come and visit it. What I want to include down here is I think I want to include maybe like a live weather report. So if anyone wants to come and use the skate park, they can check the weather ahead of time. And I think many people like skating in the rain. So it means that they can check whether it's a good day to skate for. Now I could go and create a model bound view, just like I did for this. I could create a load of fields for the current weather, and my marketer could go and update those fields every time the weather changes. But that sounds like a pretty awful job. No one wants to do that. And there's heaps of weather services out there that we can leverage. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to create a view component, and we're going to call an external weather service. And the one I've been using for a little bit is Open Weather Map. So this is a really simple, open and available weather API. There's a couple of different options. You can pass in a lat and a long. There's another way you can pass in a city if you want, and an API key. And if we scroll down, you basically get a bit of JSON back, which basically shows you what the weather currently is. So it'll give you like whether it's raining, it's moderate rain, and it'll give you some temperature data as well. So we're going to create a view component, which has a little bit of data that comes out of Sitecore, and and it's also going to call this external service as well. Okay, so let's go for it. First of all, we're going to go back to the content editor again. This is going to be a new rendering. So we need to go back and we need to follow that same process of cloning an existing rendering. This time, we're just going to go into the title and text one we just created, and we'll clone that one instead. It's going to bring up the same modal dialog we had, and this time we'll call it weather. It's just for this site, so we'll keep it in the skate park module, and then we'll make a copy of the parameters, and we'll make a copy of the data source. Okay, and you can see the weather component's been created, and it's given us our weather name again. Let's go down, and we're going to go and edit our templates once more. Now, this time what we're going to do is we're going to have that text data coming out of the weather service, but I think I'm going to add an image to go alongside it, because that can make it a bit more of a rich component, make it a little bit more engaging. So I'm going to get rid of the text component. We'll add an image field in here. We'll make it an image field, and then we'll give it the section name weather. So do things properly. And you can see our template is now updated, and we have an image field on there instead. The last thing we need to do is to go and update our available renderings once more. And you can start to see that we end up going through this flow of how we create the components, enable them, and then build them. And it's kind of a little bit of a repetitive flow, but this is basically what you're doing day to day as a developer working with XM Cloud and ASP.NET Core. So we've got the component definition created now. We've got the available in our renderings. We can go back to the page builder. We can refresh this, and then we hopefully should see it in our components. But again, grayed out because we haven't actually built anything yet. So let's go back to our component listing while the page is loading. And you can see, awesome, we're exactly where we want to be. It says the component's defined in the CMS, but our rendering host doesn't have it. Our editing host doesn't have it enabled. So let's get this out of the way and go back to Visual Studio. And let's build our weather component. So I'm going to stop this once more. We're going to be building code. And this time, ahead of time, I actually went and created the models for us, because it's out of the way. There's a few other things we needed in here. Now, we have our weather model in here. And to keep this easier, I've just basically dropped all of our classes needed into one file. I probably wouldn't do that really, but it makes things a little simpler for the demo. You can see we've added our image field in here. You can see we have our Sitecore component field defined. it's set. And this time I wanted to show it's possible to rename fields from the model as well. So I called it image in the CMS, if you remember. But because we've defined the name parameter here, it actually lets us change the property name in our model. So we can override it to the image field. That's handy if you want to name things slightly differently in your code compared to the CMS, which sometimes happens. Then you'll see we have this data section here. This data section here in this weather data class defined below. In here, you can see we have coordinates, we have weather, we have the main section, the city name. All of that is what's coming out of this JSON document here. So we have our coordinates, we have the weather piece, we have the main section, and on the bottom, I think we have name was the name of the actual city that we're looking at, which is Melbourne, where I'm based. And we don't need any other attributes on here. I've added some below for the JSON property binding because I'm just going to be using system text.json at this point when we're mapping this through. But you can see we end up with a model here, which is comprised of data which is coming from multiple sources. We have a field from the CMS, and then we have multiple fields and properties which are coming from our third-party service. Okay, so this time I think we'll go and we'll create the view first this time. At this point, we're not creating a model-bound view, so we don't need to put it in this Sitecore components folder here. So I'm going to put it directly just in this general components section here. We'll create an empty razor view again. Once more, we'll just call this weather. And I'll go and I will paste in the code for the model. And again, you can see we're just passing in our weather model here. Dump POCO, no generics, masking activity, nothing being hidden away by any weird and wonderful magic. Standard ASP.NET Core functionality. You can see we're using the SC image tag helper, which will enable that image to be content editable. And then below, we're just outputting the data which is coming from our weather service. So we have the city name, we have the general weather description, and then below we have the temperature data. So what temperature is it now? What's the feels like? And what's the max and min for the day coming up? I think that's pretty good weather information for anyone who's looking to go and skate at our skate park. Okay, so we've got the model created, we've got the view created. Next thing we need to do is to figure out how we can go and call our external third-party service to pull in our extra data. This is where the view components functionality comes in. We don't have any view components in here yet, so I'm going to have to create a new folder for it. So we'll add a new folder and we'll call that view components. And then in here, we will create the weather view component. Okay, now I'm just going to start to paste some code in here, but I won't do the whole thing all at once, and I'll kind of talk through it as we go. First of all, I do the usings. That's pretty easy. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add an inline constructor for this, and then we'll talk about what's going on. So view components in ASP.NET Core all have to come from the base view component class. This is standard ASP.NET Core MVC functionality, really well documented on the Microsoft site. If you want to learn more about what view components are, you can go over there and read all about it. You'll notice we're also injecting the view model binder. This comes out of the ASP.NET Core SDK. This is a key piece of functionality that is responsible for taking that big wall of JSON that comes out from Experience Edge and binding it to objects. So we could give it our model, basically, that is defined with the image field defined on it. And the view model binder will basically be able to go and take that wall of JSON, pick out the correct field to bind to that image in the model. So the next thing we'll do is we're just going to add a couple of fields into this class. So we have an instance of the model binder that's passed in, so we can reference it later on. And we're also going to define a view component name because we're going to have to use the name of this in multiple places. So we'll add it into a string to make sure we don't end up with spelling errors. We also have to decorate this class with the view component attribute. Again, that's part of how ASP.NET Core MVC works. And we give it the name, view component name, which is defined in here. So we're basically defining it as weather. Next up, we need to define how this is going to work. And to run a view component, what you do is you implement the invoke async if you want to run asynchronously, or there's just a standard invoke if you want to run it synchronously. We're going to be doing a bunch of calls out to, well, a single call out to external services. We're going to be doing the model binding, and both of those are asynchronous calls. So we're going to use the async method. So first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to do the CMS binding. The way I like to think of this is when does this code execute? So this code executes after the request to Edge has already been made. So the request to Edge has been made by the SDK. We've got the wall of JSON back from it. So we're not going to call Edge when this happens. All we're going to do is process the existing response that's been made. And that existing response actually exists in the main view context. The view context is a property you get access to by inheriting from view component. And this, again, is standard ASP.NET Core functionality. But what you can do is you can use the model binder now. So we basically access that model binder that was injected in using IOC. We basically tell it we want the weather model that we created to come back out. And we pass in the view context that contains all of the JSON back from Edge. And what we do is we get an instance of our model back, which, fingers crossed, should have our image field populated. What we next need to do, though, is populate that weather data, which is coming out of our third-party service. And to do that, we're just going to use a really standard HTTP client. And I've pasted my URL in here. Realistically, you'd probably put things like your API key into Secret or something else. It's an open service, it's just a demo, so we're just going to paste it in there for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to go and call that service and get our data back. So we basically await the call to get async to the URL. We check the call was successful. We then get the JSON string from the response. And then we use standard system text JSON to basically parse it into a weather data object, which then gets assigned to the data property of the model. If you remember, the model itself had two properties on there. It was the image field from the CMS, and it was the object that contained all the weather data we're calling from our third-party service. Finally, we pass it all into our view. So the view we created before, we pass the model in, and then basically the result we get back from that is what's returned out of this invoke method. And that is basically how you can build a complex view component. The last thing we need to do is to actually go and register this once more, much in the same way as we did for our model bound view. But this time we're going to register a view component instead. And to register a view component, all you need to do is pass it the string name. And that's the name that was used in the attribute that was assigned into the view component itself. So if you remember before, we had a string version of this we can reference again. Weather view component. I think I spelled that correctly. Let's see. Oh, I did. Brilliant. Okay, and we can do weather view component dot view component name. And it's a nice way of just making sure that if we update that down the track, we've only got to change it in one place. Okay, so we can hit F5 once more, and let's try and see if this all works. So it's going to go and build my application once more. When that's finished, it's going to bring up a browser. And we can see the title and text has changed because we updated that in the CMS before. So my locally running version is pulling down the updated CMS content. But the weather component isn't there yet because we haven't added it in pages. So let's go back to our page builder experience. I'm going to refresh the page again because I need pages to know that the weather component is now implemented. It's now available for us to use with this editing host. So here we can see the site's loaded. We can click over and we can see the weather components there. Let's just drag this. Let's do it at the top of here, just before these promo components. Just going to go and pull this in, and it's going to make that request over. And there we go. We can see it's now added in our data. So it's pulled in. It's saying it's Melbourne. I can look out of my window, and it is overcast clouds, and it is 29 degrees. Not sure how warm it is near you, but it's 10 to 9 in the morning, so it feels like it's going to be a warm day today. You can also see we have our image field rendered. So here it is. It's available and ready to be able to be content managed. So we can go over here, and I could go and choose an image from here. I haven't uploaded one that's suitable. Let's choose an image of the original Sitecore lady we always used to see. We can see here how we've created a complex component which has a combination of data from both CMS and from third-party sources, all pulled together by the head making requests out to different sources. It's like textbook headless development. Okay, so I just have one more slide for you guys. Where did PowerPoint? That's what I was looking for. I talked a bit about the SDK, talked a bit about the starter kit. You can access them both from these URLs. Those QR codes should take you there as well. We'd love to hear feedback. If you're using this and you see issues, we'd love to hear about issues, open issues on the repo. If you want to fix something or take on some work, we'd love to get PRs from the community. And I guess in the meantime, does anyone have any questions? I can't hear you on mute, actually.
That was a great presentation, Rob. Thank you. Going off of the last thing that you said about having issues, how do people report these? Is it like, does Sitecore support people? Do they recognize any issues that people are having with the Core SDK?
Yeah. So basically, it is managed by support as well. So you can go through support portal, or if you know what the issue is, if you want to look in SDK, you can open an issue directly on the repo as well. And me and I will get around to looking at it. Yeah.
Nice. So we have a few questions, and this one is probably a common one. All of the hipsters use MacBooks because it's VS Code, right? I'm assuming you could run VS Code. Is it have you played around with it and ran it on MacBook?
Yeah. So the advantage to running Fed first is what we call it, where basically you just run the head locally and you connect to edge. There's no dependency on a Windows machine anymore. So you can go and run it on Mac, on Linux, on anything you like. You can run it anywhere. You can run the .NET CLI, basically.
Nice. So the next question, is there any form of Helix or structured thing, whether it's for the Next.js projects or the ASP.NET Core projects?
So definitely not for Next.js. We recommend following the guidance for the language of choice, basically. So follow Next.js best practice for Next.js, Angular best practice for Angular. When it comes to .NET Core, for those of you that don't know, Helix was a set of guidance, basically architecture principles we introduced a few years ago for Platform DXP, where everything was written in .NET Core, and you had these huge .NET Core code bases you were creating. When I showed the content tree before, and there was folders for foundation, feature, and project, that was kind of the layering approach that Helix introduced. That's why it's still in the CMS. It's kind of a bit of a hangover from there. Realistically, we kind of leave it up to yourselves. We're not prescribing Helix. We don't say Helix is mandatory. If you end up building an enormous .NET code base, you should definitely follow some form of architecture principles, or it's going to get messy really, really quickly. If you want to use Helix, you can use Helix. If you want to define an architecture principle that matters, or that kind of fits better for your project, you could do that as well. Just don't put everything in one project. Just make a big mess, basically.
Yeah. And this one is interesting, Rob, because with Next.js or any of the JS frameworks with Vercel or Netlify, it's pretty smooth in terms of the CI/CD work, right? Can you tell us a little bit more in terms of how it is to set this up with the DevOps and build and all of that?
Yeah. So as you said, with Next.js, everything's integrated, basically. And this kind of comes back to the point I said about it not being natively integrated into the deploy app yet. We're working on that. When we have support for .NET editing hosts, basically everything from the CMS side will all be automated. As soon as you do a commit, your editing host will be recreated. Currently, that's not the case. So you will need to handle deployment of your production instances, your delivery instances. You'll need to handle deployment of your editing instances as well, because you have to host those externally. Majority of the time, people are probably going to be on Azure in a web app or something similar, we imagine. So how you handle that is kind of up to yourselves. Whether you still let the deploy app handle, you can still let deploy app handle all of the kind of .NET Core instances, and then you handle the rest yourself. The other option would be to kind of take over everything yourself and manage everything using the .NET CLI, so using the XM Cloud CLI to handle that as well. We have an example using that with GitHub Actions on the XM Cloud introduction repo. So if you want to see that, because we have the MVP site is built using this SDK as well. We host that in an Azure web app. And yeah, we basically took over the CI/CD process entirely for that. It's up to yourselves as options, basically. Things will become more integrated over time, but for now, it's a little manual.
All right. So the next question is it still recommended to use SXA scaffolding to create sites, or does the Sites app do something similar?
Oh, no. So through the Sites app. So let's have Sites open here. So let's go back to Sites. No, so if you go through, might make me log in again. Let's see. No, here we go. Yeah, so you basically use the Create Site button here. So it's all handled through the Sites app now. So you create a new site. I mentioned before you have the empty or the basic site. So the basic's the skate part we just looked at. And you can add your own templates in here. So if you create multi-site templates, then you basically give it a name, new site number 2. You can choose which skate part. Well, I'm going to add to the same collection as previously. Hit create site and away you go. That'll create the site in 2 or 3 minutes in the background.
And then the other question I had while you were showing the creation of the fields and replicating the fields, right? Like with the newer content editor, we're not going to have that ability. So is there something in Pages that's going to let you do that?
It's all coming. We're basically working to a state where you don't have to drop down to the content editor. Okay. That was kind of what I was saying about having to drop back. Yeah. We recently released the ability to edit non-visual fields. So that was a new one recently, where previously Pages would only support like the fields which are like title and text. You couldn't edit like your metadata fields, which aren't actually displayed. That's been that was a reason to have to drop down to the content editor. We've changed that so you don't have to anymore. Component registration, things like that are another one we're working on. So we're just basically trying to tick them off one by one and get through them to the point where where you don't need to go down to the content editor anymore. That's the end goal.
Nice. Next question is, so we no longer need the dev tunnels with the metadata editing support?
Correct. So currently, I mentioned I built the SDK locally, which included metadata support. That will be coming when it gets through PR and we publish the new NuGet packages. Currently, with the SDK, you have to use a dev tunnel. So I bring up Visual Studio again. Let me try and remember how I do this now. I think so when you run it in here, you can set up a dev tunnel, which basically allows you to say tunnel 1, temporary and public. And then what that'll do is when I run my application now, if I run it again, it'll basically create an external URL that is accessible to my local machine. So you can then go in and configure the editing hosts in Sitecore to basically point through to this URL here, which Microsoft's generated for me. The disadvantage to this is you have to do it by configuring an item in Sitecore. So you can only use one at a time. So only one developer can use that down to their developer machine, which is really clunky. So not fantastic, but when we get the metadata editing support published, then you won't have to do that anymore, basically.
Cool. So the next one is the changes required in the front-end solution starter kit for metadata editing support to work documented somewhere.
So when we publish, the SDK will get published first with a new version. Then I'll go and update the starter kit SDK. And there's not much, really. Basically, all it is, it'll be a new set of NuGet packages. There's a few things in the program CS. So it's pages handler, adding support for the pages handler. I think there's a use pages. Well, I use cycle pages when you're in editing mode. And then finally, there's some scripts that need to get injected in. So on the view layout, maybe. Yeah, so there's a tag here for the editing scripts. So basically, they're served by Edge as well. So when you connect, when metadata pages connects, Edge sends down a list of scripts that need to be loaded into the page that basically enable all of the metadata editing functionality. But once we publish SDK changes, the starter kit changes will follow really quickly, and then you'll be able to just go and see the commit, which has the changes in, and replicate those in your app.
Nice. Next question, any plans to integrate? I think you answered this, that it's in the works, right?
It is. It's in the backlog. So, embedded personalization is actually being developed. That's the one that Ivan's working on now. So, yeah, the embedded personalization and metadata were the two big ones we wanted to get knocked off first. But yeah, hopefully not too long.
And a serious question: yeah or nay on the Bundaberg diet ginger beer?
I wouldn't go diet. I'd like the original.
Nice. Thanks, Rob. This was really, really helpful and exciting. I'm starting the thing with Bala, so this is really, really exciting to see the old like .NET stuff and everything coming to life for sure.
It's awesome. Like if anyone starts using it, and even if you've just got feedback about, you like some things, you don't like things, definitely let us know. Keen to hear how people find it once they start building with it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. If anyone else has any other questions, just post it on the thread. And Marmite or Vegemite is what Camrose is asking.
Oh, that's a tough question. As an Englishman now living in Australia, like I'm pretty torn. I don't think the missus would forgive me if I said Marmite, so I'll go Vegemite. I'll sell out my homeland.
All right. Have a good one, guys.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.